All right, we have been talking in class a lot about the conflict and the confrontation between white settlers moving west and Native Americans. Today we're going to start to look at some of the reasons why settlers are going west. And the first thing that we need to understand is this term, manifest destiny. This is a belief that Americans have in the 19th century that basically means Americans have this idea that they are destined, okay, to control the entirety of the United States. So from the East Coast to the West Coast, it is their destiny to expand throughout the continent and control everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Okay, so this idea manifests destiny, that it is Americans' right, it is their destiny to expand west and control the entire continental United States. Okay, that's going to be a big push behind this idea, and the government is going to help intensify this idea by encouraging settlers to go west. Okay, so manifest destiny, I keep circling it. That is going to be a big theme for you guys. And again, the idea is that it was the destiny of the United States for Americans to live all across the country, expanding into that Western territory. Okay, hopefully in the last class period, we started to talk about some of these ideas with cowboys and cattle and the long drive and all of that stuff. So the cowboys, if we don't get to it in class, if we do, you guys can kind of skip through this a little bit. But the cowboys are largely influenced by Spanish language and the Mexican vaqueros. We'll talk about some of those key terms in class. Okay? But we think of cowboys as like this great American idea, and largely the things that we get about the cowboys largely come from the Spanish and their language and the Mexican vaqueros who were living that cowboy lifestyle. So the purpose of the cowboys during this time period was to drive cattle from Texas up to the stockyards and be shipped back to the east. Okay? The cattle trails are going to come up because of the demand for beef that grows after the Civil War. That largely comes out of the growing industrial areas in the northeast. So we have cities that are growing and they need to be fed, and so we're going to have cattle that are driven to them. So what we would have is these cowboys would round up the mavericks in the south, and then they would drive them from San Antonio earlier to Sedalia, Missouri, and then they would go east from Sedalia. But as time goes on, Sedalia becomes an issue because of weather and farmers putting up fencing, and so later Joseph McCoy is going to build the Chisholm Trail, which goes to Abilene, Kansas. Okay, and that's going to be a key for us. This is one of the big trails that cattle are going to go on. So they take them from San Antonio to Abilene, Kansas on what is called the Chisholm Trail. And Joseph McCoy kind of develops this once he sees that we're having issues getting cattle to Sedalia. The cowboy, African American and Mexican cowboys, not just white. They estimate that probably upwards of 25% of the cowboys that we think of were actually African American, and another maybe 10 to 15% were Mexican. So it's not just a bunch of white guys that we think of like in the old westerns riding the open range. A lot of them are from other ethnicities. They work really long hours, up to 14 hours when they're on the trail. And again, they are driving them, if we look back at this, on what we call the long drive from Texas up to Missouri or Kansas, and there they're put on rail cars and shipped to the east. Okay, so that is known as the long drive. So when we look at this term down here, the long drive, okay, that's what we're referring to, is that drive of cattle from Texas up to Missouri or Kansas, and then the cattle would be taken east to the major urban populations where industry is growing. Ultimately, that's going to come to an end. Obviously, we're not doing that anymore. And so there are a couple things that are going to bring the open range and that long cattle drive to an end. Okay, overgrazing of land. So over time, the cattle are going to wear out the land. Grass isn't going to grow there, so they don't have the food. It becomes an issue, and it's not as productive. A couple years of bad weather are really going to slow this down, and then the big one is the invention of barbed wire, which allows farmers to start putting up fencing so that cattle can't be driven across their land and tear up their crops and all of those things. So these three main ideas, okay, cattle overgraze the land, we have a couple years of bad weather, and then the advancement of barbed wire across the plains that farmers start to divide up their land, are going to prevent the long drive from being effective. Open grazing is not really working anymore. Open grazing is that idea that cattle just graze on the land that they come across as they're on this journey. That is going to bring an end to this idea, and we'll be talking about those ideas more in class. Okay, so that's going to begin that Western migration, the idea that we're starting to go into the West. But again, the cowboys, they're not really living in the West. I mean, they are, as much as they're working and their life is in that Western Plains area, but they're not going out there to settle and build families and things like that. We're going to have two big pushes for white settlers to move westward. And again, our idea there is manifest destiny, that it is our destiny to expand westward and control the entire United States. So the first one is the gold rush, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but the gold rush is going to be one reason Americans want or like that idea of getting rich quick, and so they're going to go out and they're going to start in the beginning panning for gold, and we might talk about that in class a little bit. That's the idea that you have a little pan and you're digging up sediment from a creek or a river, and you kind of swish it around and the gold sinks to the bottom. And from there they're going to get into bigger operations, sluice boxes, which is where you get large amounts of sediment and you put it into boxes and run water over it, and the dirt runs off and the gold sinks to the bottom, and we start mining for gold. So we're slowly going to expand into that, but that's going to happen all the way from the Dakotas to California. Okay, we see gold rushes all across the western part of the United States, and we know, having talked about the Native Americans, that's going to be one of the things that is causing that conflict. As we discover gold places, we push Native Americans around to try and get to the gold. Okay, so the gold rush is one of our big themes for westward migration, in that idea of manifest destiny. It's our land, our meaning Americans, and if we push Native Americans around to get to our land, then so be it, and that's going to lead to a lot of that conflict. The other idea is, going to be Western settlement of those areas, building homes and farms and things like that. Going back here, then, the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be a huge push for this, and really the railroad in general is the big key in all of the westward expansion. Okay, railroads going to Missouri and Kansas are what allow the cattle industry to have that big boom. Okay, if we were driving cattle from Texas to Kansas or Missouri and there wasn't a railroad there, then we wouldn't be getting the cattle back to the eastern markets, and it really wouldn't be of much use. The long drive wouldn't be of much use. So the railroad's going to be huge for the growth in that long drive. Okay, driving the cattle from Texas to Missouri or Kansas and then shipping them back east, it's going to be instrumental in that. It's also instrumental in moving westward. Okay? And specifically the Transcontinental Railroad, that's where we're talking about the railroad stretching from the east coast to the west coast. Okay? It allows for us to have big movement all the way to the west coast. Okay, so why are settlers moving west if they're not looking for gold? The big reason is because there's land, they can build a farm, build a family. The railroad is the number one innovation that influences westward expansion. So when we talk about what allows settlers to move west at such a rapid pace, it is the railroad. The railroad is the number one innovation or technology or whatever we want to call it that allows settlers to move west. Now, they're encouraged to move west by things like the Homestead Act. The government passed the Homestead Act, which gave 160 acres to a head of a household if they would live on the land, improve it by farming on it, and building a home on it for 5 years. So within 5 years, they had to have a home on it, be farming on it, and if they did that, then they would get the 160 acres for free. Okay? This is government land that we have historically set aside for Native Americans to be nomadic on and hunt buffalo and all of those things. Now the government is moving beyond that. We've talked about assimilation and the Dawes Act, and we're shrinking the area of the Native Americans to try to make them more like white Americans, and that's going to give us more land to encourage Western settlement, encourage white Americans to move west and settle. Okay? So the Homestead Act is a government act, again, 160 acres to the head of a household. They need to improve the land by farming on it and building a home on it. The Morrill Act, or the Morrill Land Grab Act, this is going to be an act that encouraged the development of farming in the West. It set up a lot of agricultural colleges. When we think of like our schools like Texas A&M, those types of schools are going to be set up through this Morrill Act or the Morrill Land Grab Act. So we have settlers that are moving west through the Homestead Act. You have the Morrill Act, which is encouraging those western territories or western states to build colleges, colleges that are designed specifically around agriculture, so that we can find better ways to farm in this dry, arid climate, things like that. So that's going to be a big push for that, and we'll talk more about that in class. Okay, but two main reasons why we're moving west: gold and farming. Okay, now the frontier over time, we're going to get into this idea of frontier economics, where they are largely dependent on the price of the grain or whatever it is that they're growing. And what we see come out of this are these huge farms. I mean, 1,500 to, I think the book says 50,000 acres. So 15,000 to 50,000 acre farms. One farm, I think in the Dakotas, was 24 square miles. So these huge farms, and what these huge farms do is they focus on growing one crop, which works for a while. But over time, as prices change, as the soil nutrients get depleted, that becomes not the most effective thing. And so you're going to have these huge farms, and smaller farmers start to compete. They take out loans to buy more land. And when prices drop, what we have are farmers that are in large amounts of debt. So farmers, they take on debt because the equipment to farm is expensive, and they want to compete with these big farms, so they take on debt to buy more land. And through that process, we're going to see what we call the frontier close. Okay? The land is going to be taken up by farmers and by large corporations that are building these huge corporate farms. So in the West, land is going to get scarcer, prices are going to drop, and we start to see these outrageous shipping prices. And we'll talk about that as we talk about the railroad. But railroads realized that these farmers didn't have any way to get their crops back to major markets in the East without them, and so they could kind of charge whatever they wanted. And we're going to see farmers get outraged at all of this stuff, land becoming scarcer, the huge amount of debt that they're taking on, the removal of greenbacks from the Civil War period, these large shipping crises, and it's going to lead to what we call the populist movement, which is our next big topic. But that is that all of these things, instead of farmers like collapsing, what they do is they rally together, and they kind of form a political community, and they start to try to change things politically. So that is the next idea that we're going to talk about. Okay, that is what I have for you guys today. There'll be a quiz attached to my website, also emailed to you, and I will see you guys in class.